The much awaited, much delayed final episode on the problem of evil. What does the narrative of the Eastern Church Fathers have to say on the topic? That's coming at you today on the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. Quick little insert here. Yes, you are going to love this. I can already feel my ribs hurt from the sort of elbow nudging, the ribbing, if you will. That's coming my way in the comments, which is that this final episode is so freaking long that it's going to be broken into 2 episodes. Okay, yes, I know. This is par for the course with me. What can I say? But here's the thing. What I can assure you of is that this part 1 and this part 2 of this final episode really is the final episode. Why? Because I recorded the whole thing. It's just that it's just way too long, to be one episode. I can't do that to you. I suppose there's also an asterisk here. We did say that we're going to do a Q&A. So I suppose we'll have a Q&A at some point here on the not so distant horizon, where we will answer your questions. So at the end, it's a good, if you like numerology, it's a good biblical number, 7 episodes on the problem of evil. And then, well, actually it should have been 6, then we rest. Well, maybe the day of rest is the Q&A episode where, we let down our hair and we just sort of, talk about stuff that's in the comments. Anyway, there you go. So enjoy this part 1 of the final episode on the problem of evil. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. As always, thanks for tuning in. We have, for those of you who know this channel, we've been doing a series on the problem of evil, and we are finally to the final episode. Well, I should probably add a caveat. Final episode with an asterisk. We did actually promise that if people were putting in comments or specifically questions related to this topic, that we might go ahead and do an entire episode related to fielding those. So that is looking likely. I think we do have a critical mass to go ahead and do an episode on that. So be expecting that at some point here in the not so distant future. Also, for those of you who follow this channel regularly, you've heard an announcement about an upcoming class that I'll be teaching, Introduction to Philosophy. For details, just jump to the last episode that we did here, and you can hear a more thorough announcement. I won't eat up our time today with that. So be watching in next week's episode for details about when registration is going to be opening up, how you can register, when it's going to be held, all that sort of stuff. So that's going to be just around the corner here. So be watching for that if you're interested in taking in a class from me, Dr. Nathan Jacobs. Now, in terms of today's episode, so we've been going through this long series on the problem of evil, and we've talked about a host of things. I mean, it's been a really long series. So we've talked about free will defenses. We've talked about qualified omnipotence. We've talked about the nature, the complexities of divine providence, what's sometimes called the problems of concomitance and incompossibility. We've talked about this complexity of the permissive will of God, specifically related to these terms from John of Damascus, called the antecedent and the consequent will of God, and the way goods and evils enmesh and sort of force certain choices in order to, permit things that God would not otherwise will. We talked about complex goods and the fact so that there are certain goods that are otherwise impossible unless you actually permit horrible things like, you can't forgive unless there is something to forgive. You can't show mercy unless there's an infraction in order to show mercy and things like that, as well as other sort of scenarios that we ran through. So we've talked about a lot of those sorts of things. And we even got into some of these dynamics concerning divine providence and the idea that divine providence is not actually sort of this mechanistic, at least according to the Eastern Church Fathers, it's not this sort of mechanistic thing that we oftentimes think about where God just intervenes and interrupts. We talked about the sort of enmeshing of God and world in this sort of synergistic way, the idea that the normative mode of divine providence is that God is supposed to operate in and through his creatures, and that the fall ends up cutting off those channels of divine activity and so on. So we've talked about a host of different things here. So what I want to do today is I want to try to take all these different sort of disparate parts, these sort of scattered insights, and draw them together into a cohesive narrative using as our guide the Eastern Church Fathers. And for obvious reasons. I'm Eastern Orthodox. Those of you who have who follow this channel or who have listened to me talk about my journey, my sort of wild ride to Orthodoxy, you go see that episode if you're unfamiliar with me. But you know that I am a philosopher who ended up going down this road that ultimately led me to Eastern Orthodoxy. So I think Eastern Orthodoxy is true. And so when I talk about philosophy, when I talk about metaphysics, my worldview, my metaphysics end up aligning with that of the Eastern Church Fathers. So to no surprise, if I'm going to try to pull these things together into a cohesive narrative, meta-narrative, if you will, obviously it's going to be drawn from, influenced by, rely upon the Eastern Church Fathers in significant ways. And so that's the goal here today. And now the reason I think a narrative form is really important is because even though all of these different insights are extremely useful, and they really are, I don't want to discount anything that we've gone through in the past. Talking about things like the free will defense, or talking about things like divine omnipotence, or talking about things like divine foreknowledge is actually a really useful exercise, because what that tends to expose is that a lot of us enter into discussions, right? Discussions about, God ought to do this or God ought to do that. And we do that in a way which is rather presumptuous. We just presume that anything we might imagine is obviously possible, and any sort of objection we might float out that God should have done this or he should have done that, or obviously God could do this, is oftentimes sort of uttered without real scrutiny about whether or not we're correct about that, whether we're saying something that's meaningful, whether what we're saying God ought to have done is something that is really sort of possible. And a lot of these sorts of things, when you start to examine the questions of qualified omnipotence, whether or not, omnipotent means that God can do any crazy word combination we might put together, that's really useful in disrupting our assumptions, many of which may be false, about God and the operative powers of God. When we sit there and we, sort of say, well, God should have made free creatures that always do the good, right? Looking at the free will defense and the question of self-determination and the nature of creatureliness and things like that is really useful, because it disrupts some of the underlying assumptions that we have, that obviously you can make free creatures that always do good, and God could have and God should have, and so on and so forth. And similarly, even when we're considering even more sort of like wildly abstract questions like divine foreknowledge, when we sit there and say, well, God obviously knew that so-and-so would have done this, and so he should have disrupted it in advance, or he should have organized things such that that's not what had happened. What we saw when we touched on the Eastern patristic understanding of divine foreknowledge, we discovered that they actually offer pretty good reasons to think that maybe God doesn't have that sort of hypothetical futurities, those sorts of hypothetical futurities floating about in his mind, because they need to be grounded in something. And those aren't really grounded unless he chooses to create creatures and chooses to let the world unfold in a certain way, and so on and so forth. And then also they called into question whether or not that would be the best thing to do, because presumably when God chooses to set the world on a certain course of action, he chooses that because that is best. And so when we're saying he should have done otherwise, we're actually saying that maybe he should have done a different course of action, which betrays that we're outcome oriented, whereas God is not necessarily outcome oriented. He's concerned with the good, we're concerned with results, and so on. Now, I'm not going to rehash all those different topics. If you haven't listened to the prior episodes on the problem of evil and you're like, Jacobs, what are you talking about? Hypothetical futurities, God doing the best, qualified omnipotence, free will, and things like that. Well, we've got 4 episodes at this point. I think it's 4 episodes at this point that discuss all those different topics. So I will say this episode is going to be a little bit presumptuous. And I mean presumptuous in the sense that I have a tendency to actually presume that my audience doesn't necessarily know what I'm talking about. And so I tend to err on the side of redundancy more so than on the side of presumption, because I want to make sure that people understand what I'm saying. And so with that in mind as a goal, redundancy tends to be a little safer than presumption. But for this episode, given how much time and groundwork it takes to talk about qualified omnipotence, to talk about things like hypothetical futurities in terms of divine knowledge, to talk about the dynamics of providence, to talk about the free will defense, to talk about the metaphysics of creatureliness, and so on, consider those 4 episodes to be groundwork, right? They're groundwork for this sort of thing. So I'm not suggesting that you won't understand this episode if you don't go back and listen to the prior 4. But what I am suggesting is I'm probably going to move quick across certain points that we've touched on in those other episodes. So if you find yourself getting lost, or maybe you are like, I think I'm getting like 75%, but having not listened to the prior episodes, there's like 25% where I'm not really sure. Well, that's what those other episodes are for. Now, again, my point here when I started down this road was to say that those sorts of points that are made, right, about qualified omnipotence or divine knowledge or free choice or whatever it might be, they're really useful in disrupting those assumptions that we have. But the problem is they tend to have this sort of punctuated, atomized sort of impact where it's like, okay, so I guess maybe God can't make free creatures that he determines in order to do good. Okay, so that disrupts that objection. But it's really just sort of an isolated point. Whereas what the benefit of an overall narrative does, or a meta-narrative does, is it pulls together all of these things into a cohesive picture, right? And that's really the goal of today's episode. Is what we want to do is we want to take all of these different sort of disparate and very useful insights and draw them together into a narrative that says, well, what does this really mean, right? Like, what sort of God are we talking about? What sort of creatures are we? What sort of world are we in? And where is all of this headed, right? And that's what a narrative is really useful in offering. And so that's what's on the docket for today. We're going to go ahead and we're going to look at the Eastern patristic narrative about God and the world, about things like free will, about good and evil, and ultimately where all of this is headed. And along the way, what we'll be doing is hearkening back to different insights that are more thoroughly fleshed out in prior episodes. So with that, let's go ahead and jump in. Now, in terms of building our narrative, let's begin with the question of the nature of God. Because really, when you're looking at the problem of evil, one of the first questions being asked is, well, what sort of God is there? Are we talking about, first of all, one that's a fantasy, he doesn't exist? Or are we suggesting that he is malevolent, right? Or are we saying he's impotent, right? These are the sorts of dichotomies that David Hume set up when he talked about the problem, right? Is he impotent? Is he malevolent? Or obviously the atheist option, or maybe he is not, right? And so the very nature of the problem is setting up a question about the nature of God. And so that's a really important starting point. And when we're talking about the Eastern patristic concept of God, there are certain things that we need to recognize right out of the gate that are essential to how we see the world and how we approach this sort of question. The first is the presumption that God is good, right? Now, we talked about this issue in the context of metaphysical dualism, right? That the Eastern patristic understanding, first of all, does not take the route of saying that evil is an illusion, right? That good and evil are real features of the world. But what we also talked about then is the possibility of saying, well, maybe good and evil are just two equal and opposing forces, and maybe there's a good God and there's an evil God. But we talked about the problem that emerges from metaphysical dualism, namely that a consideration of the nature of good and evil reveals that goodness has a certain autonomous existence. You can have pure, unadulterated goodness, things that are just good in and of themselves. And yet evil always has this sort of parasitic character to it. And so it's a twisting or a defect or some sort of attachment or something like that to something that is otherwise good, right? And the easy examples are things like blindness, where sight is a good, but blindness is a physical evil, but it's not an additive property, right? It's a subtractive one. But we can also even see this when we consider the most sort of horrifying examples of gruesome moral evils. For example, in Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, right? We talked about how Ivan ushers out these horrifying examples, and one of the examples he uses is child murder. And we talked about the fact that when it comes to child murder, one of the things that is often missed is we're so blinded, by just sort of the pure palpable nature of the evil that's involved in that. One of the things that we miss is that the impact of that evil is so palpable that we oftentimes miss the fact that what makes it palpable is the extreme goodness that it's attached to. So it's the very fact that children are so beautiful and good and innocent that makes the fact, the harm to them, so potent, so palpable. And this is where we talked about a certain proportionate relationship, that the greater the good of a thing is, the greater the evil is when it's impacted, right? If I do a little bit of a doodle and then you rip it up or mar it, that's not very impactful. But if you go and you attack, Michelangelo's Pieta and try to destroy it, like there is something like really palpable about that. And so there's a certain proportionality that emerges in terms of the impact of an evil relative to the good that is harming. And for that reason, what you end up finding, and this is something that actually emerges very early on in pagan philosophy, this is an early insight, is that goodness actually has sort of a substantial existence all its own, whereas evil is always this sort of parasitic, twisting, distorting, corrupting of something else. It doesn't have independent existence. And that's one of the reasons why God was presumed to be the good, right? That the highest, most substantial being, right? The supreme being must be supreme in goodness, must be the good itself. And incidentally, just as a sort of interesting aside here, you can see this progression in pagan thought. So if you look at the Homeric gods, the gods are not necessarily good and evil. They're just sort of like our guys and their guys. Whereas it's with Hesiod that what you start to have is you have the emergence of the concept of a good that's above the gods, right? A higher good that's above that judges good and evil. And for that reason, then, what you start to see is you start to see the conclusion as pagan philosophy develops in people like Plato and beyond, which is something that's affirmed by the Jews and the Christians as well, the idea that reality itself, ontology itself, being itself is good. And evil is always sort of this negative shadow existence. And that's why whatever this highest being is that we call God, he must be the good. Because the problem is, if you were to suggest, for example, that there is a malevolent deity, first of all, its malevolence would require things that are otherwise good, like existence, like free will, like reason, and things like that. So it wouldn't be pure evil. And that shadow existence would be true of it. But also, in order to judge it as evil, there would have to be some higher principle that's saying it's wrong in its use of goodness and intellect and so on. And that was the criticism that was leveled in terms of metaphysical dualism. So you can go and listen to a more thorough treatment on that topic. But for that reason, what you get to is the conclusion that the highest, right, which is what Aristotle calls God, what Plato calls God, when you talk about the highest, you are talking about something that is, pure goodness itself, that is the good. And really with the Eastern Church Fathers, you find the same sort of thing, the conclusion that when we're talking about God, we're talking about the idea that he is good. And on the one hand, this is ontological. This is a statement about the fact that all particular goods that we encounter are an articulation, sort of a refraction of divine goodness itself. And so when we identify something as good and we desire it and we long for it, the real object of our longing ultimately is God himself, because that's what's being refracted through those finite articulations of goodness. So God is the good. On the other hand, and we'll talk about this more when we get to the providence side of this narrative, what we see is that providence and the goodness of God in that context, the active goodness of God, is an active goodness that not only expresses his own goodness and other good things, but also desires the good of the things that are out there in the world, desires the good, the proper end, the teleology, the well-being and flourishing of other beings. So we'll get to that when we get to providence. So all that is to say, that all of that is context to say that when we're talking about God, first of all, we're talking about the good, right? The highest. We are talking about a being who is the good. The other thing that we find here is that also this good God in the Christian context is rather unique relative to the pagans. So I touched on in prior episodes the fact that amongst the pagans, it's not really obvious that God has free will or that he's even a person. So on the one hand, you do have in certain figures like Plato, you have this very anthropomorphic picture of God. God desires all things to be as like him as possible. He looks around for a model in order to shape the world and so on. You do have anthropomorphic language like that. But it's not clear that Plato actually thinks that, like God has free choice, right? Like that he might have done differently or something like that. And I think it's late, and even in certain later Platonists, that's explicitly denied. I think it's Proclus. Is it Proclus? I think it is. Who basically, when considering the question of whether or not, God looking around for an archetype to build a world and things like that means that there was some sort of contrary choice involved in that, and I think he denies it. I think that's the Neoplatonists I'm thinking of. But anyway, regardless, it's not obvious that there's any sort of act of will in the sense of Aristotle. When Aristotle's God produces the world, the world is really sort of a reaction. It's a material reaction to the perfection of God. So it's not as if God is making choices about, what sort of world to make in the great chain of being and things like that. With the Stoics, it's very much like the world itself is sort of we ourselves within the divine organism, because it's a form of pantheism or panentheism, depending on how you read them. But and so this is merely sort of the developmental articulation of the divine being and things like that. So the very fact that amongst the Jews and the Christians, God makes choices is really rather unique. So it's really rather unique that amongst Christianity, what you start to find in the Eastern Church Fathers, what you begin to find is that God actually chooses to make the world. He didn't have to make the world. Not all the pagans thought that. In fact, in most paganism, the majority of paganism, it does seem like the world is kind of inevitable. It's an overflow or a refraction or an effect of divinity. Whereas for the Eastern Church Fathers, God makes a choice. He makes a choice to create the world. Also, amongst the Eastern Church Fathers, you get contrary choice, right? You see this in the Cappadocians, you see this in John of Damascus, where they're really insistent that it's rather clear God can do things that he doesn't in fact do. John of Damascus, for example, makes this point. God could destroy the world right now, and he's choosing not to do it. So they do believe in divine contrary choice. And the language of choice does appear in the Cappadocians with regard to creative activity. God chooses to make the world. He chooses to make you and me. And that choice is rather unique amongst the pagans. A further uniqueness about that is also the idea that he doesn't just choose to make the world in the generic, but rather he also chooses to make you and me. He has an interest in the type of world he's going to make, and he has an interest in the type of sort of care and narrative that's going to play out as he guides this world. As I mentioned in prior episodes, for the pagans, there is a sense in which God oftentimes, like for example with Plato, he creates the world and then he delegates, right? He delegates to the gods, he delegates to the rational souls, the care of creation, then goes back to contemplating the forms. And this is not uncommon amongst the pagans, the idea that providence is really sort of by proxy, right? The idea that God delegates the care of the world to others. And so there's almost this proto-deism. Whereas in Alexandrian Judaism, for example, and then Christianity, you actually have God being proactive in the world in his governance. Yes, there's delegation, right? There is that. There's something true about the idea that God does delegate care of the world to angels and to man, and we'll talk about that as we move forward. But the fact of the matter is that God's interest, his foresight, his consideration of how to care for the world properly, not just in its initial creation, but in its history, is something that's rather unique amongst the Jews and then the Christians. So that stands out. And it also stands out because that becomes an indication of two other things. First of all, that are further unique amongst the pagans. First of all, when we're talking about God and God considering the type of world that he makes, you get amongst the Eastern Church Fathers a rather unique insight that stands out in contrast with the pagans. So with people like Plato, for example, who are realists, and obviously I've talked about realism here before. Anybody who follows this channel knows that. Go see the most important question if that's one that you're unfamiliar with. But they were realists. They believed that the structures that we observe out there in the world in terms of genera, species, and common properties and things like that have a divine origin, that our mind is not just sort of inventing mental fictions, but it's observing real structures that are out there that originate with God. But amongst the pagan realists, it wasn't obvious that God chooses to make you and me. right? There was a sense in which, like, yeah, sure, even if God chooses to, let's say, model a world after, the forms, and we're talking about Plato here, for example, that model is really material instances, right? Material replicas, you and me, of archetypal ideas of the forms. But it's not obvious that God ever decides that he wants Dr. Jacobs to exist, or you, dear listener, to exist. I'm talking about you, Steve. I'm talking about you, Kevin. I'm talking about you, Barbara. Like all of you folks who are listening here, it's not obvious that God wants you to be there if you're a Platonist, for example. And yet, amongst the Eastern Church Fathers, what you find is a certain doctrine, what is called the logoi. And this is an interesting feature of Eastern patristic thought. What they recognize is what happens is if the archetypal ideas or the words of God, right, these sort of archetypal plans in the mind of God, in the logos, are things that are laying out in advance the things that God intends to make. And if the individual is a substantial thing, then God's designs, right, God's ideas would not just include generics. It wouldn't be just generic man, and then there's sort of this accidental byproduct of Dr. Jacobs showing up. Instead, because the Eastern Church Fathers developed a robust concept of the individual, largely related to the doctrine of the Trinity, which we'll come back to in a second, they came to the conclusion that God actually has an archetypal idea of you and of me, right? And he has designs for what you and I are supposed to become. This is actually specifically related to, and at least in part, this goes to some of how they understand predestination, the idea that you are made to become a saint. That is your proper end. Now, you can resist that and move in corrupted modes, and we'll get to the free will stuff, but God intends to create you, and in intending to bring you into existence, he also intends certain outcomes and ends for you, namely that you become a saint. And so in this sense, what we find is we find a God who is extremely personal, right? This is something that is oftentimes said about the Christian view of God, that God is personal. And that's quite true. And we see that in two ways in the Eastern patristic narrative. The one way is relational. So this goes to the things that I was just talking about. God doesn't just create a world system, but he in fact remains provident over the unfolding history of that system. Also, he doesn't just create generic species of things, but he has designs and intentions with regard to individuals. So that's one place where we see the personal nature of God. God freely chooses to create. He freely chooses to interact with the world. He freely chooses to be provident over it and not simply delegate it or return to the contemplations of the forms. And in doing that, he also freely has designs for individuals, people like you and me. The other place, of course, where we see this is in the doctrine of the Trinity itself. And this really is the area where I had mentioned that the Eastern Church Fathers are rather unique in terms of their understanding of developing a concept of the individual or the particular or the subject, whichever translation you want to use for it, or the person. I don't like that term, but anyway. The reason I say this is because this is another area where there's sort of a deficit in pagan thinking. I said that weird, deficit. Okay, that was better. Where there's sort of a deficit in pagan ways of thinking that the Eastern Christians, especially, Christians generally, but Eastern Christians especially, ended up developing, fleshing out a concept. So the question of the individual was something that in pagan thought was extremely sort of under-considered. It was an underdeveloped concept. There was such an interest due to people like Plato and Aristotle, the realists, right? The realist tradition was so interested in generics, what the medievals would call universals, these idea of genera and species and common properties, what is common and repeated, right? What is shared across multiple subjects. They were so interested in that there was really sort of underdeveloped the question of what makes the individual. And this is one of the reasons why you almost see a punting to it in different sort of metaphysical systems. You see with certain people like the Stoics, they're like, I don't know, maybe there's an idiosyncratic property that you have. With Aristotle, he kind of defines it negatively, like, I don't know, maybe it's where you run out of predicates, meaning the sort of generic terms you're using, and then you're at the individual. But it was really an underdeveloped concept. And if you want to see more on that, you can see my essay on what is it? The idealism of the Eastern Church Fathers, I think is what the article is called, something along those lines. We'll link to it. But I talk about that in that context. Whereas with the Eastern Church Fathers, because of the doctrine of Trinity at first, and then also Christology, they were forced to really sort of consider what is a person, what is the subject, what is the individual, because they recognize when you're talking about a common divine nature. In the Trinitarian discussion, the initial Trinitarian discussion was about, is the Son of God, right, the second person of the Trinity, is he of the same nature as the Father? And the answer was yes, right? But that's why at Constantinople, when articulating not just their commonality, but also their distinction, there was a need to further develop and flesh out, like, what is that distinction? What are we talking about? And so the language of hypostasis was really sort of developed in a way in order to give some sort of articulation to the concept that an individual or a subject, you and me, the non-repeatable side of reality, is in some way substantial and has some sort of ontological status all its own. It's not just sort of an epiphenomenal sort of happening that's, just sort of the result of a weird conglomeration of properties or something like that. It's not just an accident. It's its own substantive reality. You and me are substantial features of the world. And this is one of the reasons this comes through in the articulation of the term hypostasis. So the term hypostasis itself was originally a synonym with the word ousia, so the word that's also used for nature. Those two terms were synonyms, actually all the way up through Nicaea, and that's why one of the anathemas at Nicaea actually says, like, it condemns anybody who says that there's three hypostases. And that's because at that time they were still used as synonyms. But the Cappadocian fathers, right after Nicaea, they recognized that this caused a point of confusion amongst a lot of early Christians, because I think it's in Basil. Yes, it's in one of Basil's letters where he's like, look, there's all sorts of confusion here. He's like, some people are talking about, three ousiai, and some people are talking about one. Some people are talking about three hypostases, and some people are talking about one. And there's all sorts of confusion. And the reason there was confusion is because at the time, the term substance, it could mean the genus, it could mean the species, it could mean the individual. In fact, in Aristotle, it does. That's why he adds other terms like primary and secondary substance to try to differentiate. But the terms themselves, substance, just was rather, nondescript because it had a versatility to it. So basically, the Cappadocian fathers ended up introducing an innovation in language for the sake of clarity. So there's a very definitive break in language where basically, Basil is like, look, from now on, we're only using ousia to refer to the nature or the essence of a thing. We're only using hypostasis to refer to the subject or the individual. And so that's where those terms end up differentiated for the sake of clarity. The concept was already there. Like I said, in Aristotle, he just used other terms like primary and secondary substance. But substance itself had this sort of broad use. But for the Cappadocian fathers, they actually just differentiate the two terms in order to say, like, this one now refers to the generic, the common nature. This one refers to the person who has that nature. And that's where you get the ousia hypostasis, or essence person, if you've heard that language used in reference to the Trinity. I don't love that translation of it, but I'm not going to get sidetracked on that. That's where you get that sort of definitive break. And the question is, well, why, right? Why do they choose those terms? Well, part of it is because Origen had already used a hypostasis in combating the Sabellians, or the modalists, if you know them by that term, the people who thought like, well, there's only one God, he's a generic guy, and he puts on three different masks. And so the masks are the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, right? But behind them all, there's just sort of like one common actor. That's incidentally why I don't like the word person, because a persona or, prosopon in Greek would have been like the appearance, right? The face of the thing. And that oftentimes had Sabellian connotations. But be that as it may, Origen had already used it against the Sabellians the intent of saying, like, look, no, the Son and the Father, they are substantially distinct, right? And here he meant distinct persons or subjects or individuals, or whatever term you want to use. And that's why in that context that had already been used. So that's one of the reasons why the Cappadocians picked up on it. And also it had a certain sort of way of illustrating the underlying metaphysics. So in Epistle 38 in Basil's Corpus, attributed to Basil, some people think it's written by Gregory, this is the first instance where we get like hypostasis being explained. And the reason the term is used is it's because, at least how it's explained in this context, is to say that the nature of a thing is abstract. It has no concrete reality to it. So when we talk about human, right, we encounter concrete instantiations of human, you and me. What we don't find is just like generic humanity just sort of floating out there in the air or something like that. And so the way this is articulated in Epistle 38 is that the nature, right, the essence, has no stasis on its own. And so what you need is a hypostasis, right? Something that is concretely real, that is substantial, a substance that has it and gives it concrete instantiation. And so that is why they really liked that term as a way of articulating the underlying, actually, metaphysics of what they thought the individual is. So the individual is that non-repeatable, substantial reality that sits beneath a generic nature and has that nature, you and me. Now, the reason I offer that aside, the reason that's relevant here is because when you're talking about the Trinity, you actually are, in the Eastern Church Fathers, what you're talking about in the doctrine of the Trinity, or you're talking about three persons, right? Three subjects. Yes, they have a common nature. And having that common nature, they have, they are worshiped and glorified. They have the same sort of nature that gives rise to all the same attributes. They have all the same energies, that sort of thing, equal in dignity, all of that sort of stuff. But what you have is they are distinct. The Father is not the Son, and the Son is not the Spirit, and the Spirit is not the Father or the Son, right? Like, they actually are distinct. And for that reason, you also actually see that there is some sort of personal communion between them. You see that the Son speaks to the Father. You see that the persons love one another, right? And this is actually, again, this is something that is very unique amongst the Eastern Christians. Now, on the one hand, it was not unique, actually, to talk about some sort of distinctions in God. This was already there in the pagans, right? So you actually see this already anticipated based on the Jewish texts in Alexandrian Judaism. People like Philo of Alexandria had already differentiated God's logos and his power from God himself, like that there's a distinction between God and his logos, right? And Philo had gone ahead and actually referred to the logos as deuteros theos, right, like second God. And yet, it somehow is God at the same time. So you already had people like Philo of Alexandria toying with those sorts of things. And there's dispute over like how Trinitarian that really is. But nonetheless, there was a recognition of some sort of distinction there. But the level in which the Eastern Christians, right, understand God to be personal, the fact that these distinct hypostases, these distinct subjects actually talk to one another, actually love one another, that is something that is really unique. And so here what we begin to find again and again in the Eastern Church Fathers is that where the narrative begins is with a God who is, first of all, Trinity, right? Where you actually have several persons who have this common divine nature. Second of all, what's unique about that is because of that, you actually see a certain personhood that is there in terms of the interaction of the divine persons and ultimately how they then relate and interact with creatures. So that sort of, personhood that you find in God is really sort of unique in the Christians, just in the sense that it's quite obvious that God is not just an abstract force. And also with that, for that reason, what you also see is a God who is not just good in an abstract sense, but also good in a personal sense, making free choices about whether or not to create the world, how to create the world, and how to guide and care for that world. And that's not even in a faceless like humans and rocks and plants, but that's also about individual persons whom he chooses to make, like you and like me, who he has a direct concern for. So that is the God that you're starting with when you're talking about the Eastern patristic narrative. Now, also with this, one of the features that we saw is that this God is rational. And so one of the big commitments that you find here amongst the Eastern Church Fathers is the idea of what I've called qualified omnipotence. The idea that what you have is that when we look out into the world, this is the realism that I've talked about so many times, that when we look out into the world, what we see is we see rules, we see genera, we see species, we see these structures. And the conviction is that what we're observing is actually patterns of the divine mind. And so this was common amongst the pagans, that's true, that we see this is the concept of the logos amongst the Stoics, this is the concept of nous amongst the Platonists, this is the concept of wisdom amongst the Jews. And so, but here within the Eastern Church Fathers, we see it, the idea that God is actually rational, and that when we're looking out into the world and observing these structures, we are observing structures that are divine in nature, that are divine in origin. We are observing structures imposed on the world, articulated in the world, that are an expression of the divine mind itself. Now, for that reason, there was a conviction that reason itself, rationality itself, is not a human invention or a construction, right? Just like we discover math, we don't invent math. So in the same way, we discover logic, we don't invent logic. And the importance of that is to say that the logical structures that we observe, things like the law of contradiction, are actually rooted in the divine mind itself. Those are features of reality. They are extensions of God. And for that reason, this is where we get to what I called qualified omnipotence. The idea that the Christians had always, from the earliest points, and certainly amongst the Eastern Christians held, is the conviction that contradictions and the nonsense they represent are nonsense not just for you and for me, but also for God. And this comes out very clear in the Arian Dispute. So during the Arian Dispute, it becomes very evident that Arius is proposing certain things that the Eastern Christians are saying, that's nonsense, and not even God can do it. So, for example, God cannot create a second God. And then also, for reasons that we talked about under the metaphysics of creatureliness, the Eastern Fathers understand creatures to be inherently changeable or mutable. They understand us to be inherently developmental. They understand us to be inherently material, and so on. And so when Arius wants to talk about God creating the Son of God, right? So this was the Arian heresy, the idea that the second person in the Trinity, the Son of God, was a creature and not divine in nature. When Arius wants to talk about God creating a creature who is somehow still unchangeable, who is somehow immaterial, who is somehow unchangeably good, and so on, that the other Eastern Christians said that's nonsense. And not even God can do that. That was the insistence. And that's what qualified omnipotence is all about. Qualified omnipotence actually suggests that when we're sitting here and we're saying it's a contradiction and it's nonsense to talk about a self-determining creature or a free creature who is determined by something not itself, right? Namely God. Or to put in more common parlance, that God should create free creatures that are not free, right? Something like that. That nonsensical statement that falls into this sort of bare contradiction is actually nonsense and contradiction for you and for me, and also for God himself. And so when talking about the conviction that God can do anything, the early Christian conviction, which remained the dominant Christian conviction actually through all of history, the opponents of this were always the outliers, was that, yes, God can do anything, but nonsense and contradictions are not things. In order to say that God can, you actually have to offer up some sort of coherent statement. And when you're getting into contradictions, you're in the realm of incoherence. So not even God can do that, because you haven't even really offered a coherent that. And this is the important part. So now we're talking about a free being, a personal being, a being who is good, a being who is omnipotent and powerful, but also because he is rational, that omnipotence and that power is in accord with the boundaries of reason and with logic. And that's one of the reasons why omnipotence is not that God can do any sort of nonsensical utterance we may offer, but rather God can do anything that is a thing. Now, all of this carries us into the topic of creation. So as already said, when God chooses to create, this is a choice according to the Eastern Christians. This is not just sort of an inevitable overflow. This is not an impersonal effect upon matter by some being who is supremely perfect, like in Aristotle or something like that. Rather, what this is this is a choice. God freely chooses to make the world according to the Eastern Church Fathers. Now, what is the nature of this choice? What is going on? Why choose to make a world at all? And this is where we get into a critical distinction for the Eastern Church Fathers, the distinction between God's essence and his energies. Again, not going to belabor this episode by doing a thorough fleshing out of that. But suffice it to say that the distinction that here emerges is a distinction between the nature of thing and the way that nature expresses itself. So, for example, you and I both have the nature of mind, right? You are a rational being. I'm a rational being. We share that in common as part of our nature. But that nature, even though it's totally abstract when we just sort of bring it up, it sort of articulates, it doesn't sort of, it does, it articulates itself, the nature of mind articulates itself as we freely choose to use it. So right now, I am freely choosing to use the powers of mind in the operative power, the expression, the energies, the processions, whatever term you want to use, right? Some sort of expression or articulation of that nature in the choice to speak and in the choice to start to articulate some of these truths that I'm offering to you. You, on the other hand, the abstract nature of mind is concretely articulated or expressed in your choice to listen and try to process and understand what's being said by me, right? These are distinct operations. We have a common nature of mind, but we are distinctly using it, right? Our use of it is distinct. And that sort of distinction, right, between the nature of a thing and the operative powers or expressions, the free expression of that nature, is critical to understanding what's going on here. I've used in the past to sort of draw out this type of distinction, examples like art, right? And I've talked about the fact that, I am an artist. And if we like hid my paintings back there or something like that, and you were like, okay, you're an artist. Like, what does that mean? Okay. Are you any good? Right. And we could sit here and we could describe the sort of abstract powers of art, right? The ability to draw or to paint that reside within me, but it would remain unarticulated. It would remain a mere abstraction to you, as we talked about that. And what you would need in order to really sort of have a sense of what is within me is you would need a concrete expression. And so that's where, if I freely choose to utilize those powers, those skills of art, and I begin to draw, now what you're getting is you're getting an expression, an operation, an operative power, an articulation of that otherwise abstract power. And it's articulating itself in a concrete act, in a concrete artifact, right? This manifestation, this outward manifestation of that inward art that is within me. So, and this is what the Eastern Church Fathers see happening in the act of creation itself. When we talk about the divine nature, that is in some ways beyond our direct gaze and our direct grasp. And even if we could, right, it's infinite, it's boundless. This is why it's understood to be, in some ways, one of the terms that's used is it's apergraptos, right? You can't draw a line around it. And that's actually literally what it means when it says it's incomprehensible, right? Because when you're talking about comprehension, you're talking about this sort of ability to get your mind around a thing. So it's beyond that sort of direct grasping or gaze or something like that. But the fact of the matter is, my artistic powers are also beyond your direct gaze. You can't rip open my chest and be like, there it is. I see your artistic powers floating about in your chest, Dr. Jacob, something like that. You can't do that. But what you can see is the articulation or expression of it as I produce artwork. And so in the same way, the divine nature is articulated as the persons of the Trinity choose to express and articulate those things in the creation of a world, just as I, as an artist, express my artistic powers through the production of artwork. Now, this is also what then explains why God creates a hierarchy of beings, or what has been called the great chain of beings. So this is, again, another point that we talked about. The very fact is that if I were to go ahead and I was, by analogy, try to show you how I can draw, right? And you might have, and this sort of thing that's actually happened, right? Some little kid's like, oh, you're an artist. Can you draw for me this cartoon character? And the answer is like, yeah, I can. Sure. Okay. Maybe I already know what that character looks like and I just draw it, or you can pull it up and I'll replicate it, whatever. But that is a very tiny glimpse of my artistic ability, because it's a very specific, first of all, it's a very specific form of drawing. In this case, most cartoon characters are a form of line drawing. And so there's not really a lot of shading involved or anything like that. So in terms of technique, it is only one form of technique. It's also, sort of very limited in the sense that it is, cartoons represent a very specific mode of, creative representation of a form and things like that, as contrasted with, say, a surreal representation or a realist representation or even an abstract representation and so on. And so as we talked about is that, the powers of an artist, for example, are rather diverse. And that diversity of those things, in order to truly articulate it for any sort of observer, you really do need an entire portfolio. And so in the same way, if you wanted to understand, the work of Bach, for example, the genius of Bach, what you'd have to do is you would have to look at all of the different things he's composed over the course of his life. And only then do you start to get a fully three-dimensional view of his creative powers. And so it is with regard to God. If the divine nature just made angels, that would certainly tell you something about God, but it wouldn't tell you everything about his creative power and his wisdom. And so what you see is that the entire concept of the great chain of being is that this hierarchy of beings, from, very humble beings like rocks and plants to more sort of impressive and dynamic beings like animals and rational animals and angels, are all meant to fully flesh out and articulate the divine wisdom and power and goodness and justice and all the like. And then also with that, what you start to find is, again, like I've used the analogy with regard to art, the idea that different techniques are incompatible. I've used this analogy in past episodes where I talked about like certain painterly techniques. The entire point actually is to see the movement of the paint. And so it's thick paint and it's quick and it's painted wet on wet and things like that. And then there's these other very long form, sort of like glaze painting, for example, classical forms of painting, where you don't want brush strokes. And part of the refinement and the layering and the drying is all part of the process. And those are incompatible. But they are both expressions of artistic prowess. They are both expressions of the artistic powers or skills that are within the artist. And so in the same way, when you're talking about God, to only make one type of being, for example, is to actually only offer you a small glimpse of articulation of the divine nature. So the diversity of the chain of being is there specifically in order to fully flesh out and articulate, filling up the concept of God, which with as much content as possible, so to speak, all the different dynamics of divine wisdom and power and goodness. Now, with this, what you also find is the conviction that our world is actually one creature in some way. This is a sort of thing that actually emerges. It emerges in Plato's Timaeus, where it becomes apparent that the forms are not just a series of, sort of archetypes, archetypal statues that sit in some, transcendent museum or something like that, but rather there's a recognition that when it comes to creatures, there are overlapping properties. The forms overlap. And this was an insight that was carried on and echoed in Alexandrian Judaism and then in Eastern Christianity. The recognition that we have certain overlapping properties. On the one hand, we see this really evidently where we can talk about, we could build sort of a porphyry tree, right? Porphyry tree being the sort of schematic that's breaking down, well, there's living things and there's not living things. Okay, well, within that genus of living things, there's a lot of other things, right? There are things that are rational and there are things that are not. There are things that are sentient and things that are not. Things, that have the capacity of locomotion and so on. And then within that, you also see things that are legged and things that are not legged. You see things that are winged and things that are not winged and so on. That all of these sort of different overlapping, intersecting properties are there for a very good reason, because they start to break down and schematize all the different ways, all the different diversity that is possible for a rational being, right? Just like when you go through a truth table, for example, and you can start to identify all the different ways in which things might combine. So when you start to articulate or finitize something, what you start to see is that the intersecting possibilities, right? The overlaps and the disconnects are the very things that create that type of diversity, right? What is common and what is contrary. And And so this is what's happening in the construction of the great chain of being, that God is articulating his wisdom and his goodness and his power through all these different finite refractions. Now, yet, what this also indicates is that on the one hand, there is a desire to maximally express that nature that is beyond all natures, just like for an artist who expresses his creative powers through a vast array of works of art, so it is with God, articulating that goodness, refracting it through as many sort of small mirrors, as it were, as possible. And yet also with this, what you get is you get the complexities of divine providence. And this is where we talked about the issues of what was called concomitance and incompossibility. The idea that certain goods might sort of entangle with each other, or certain goods might exclude other goods, or certain goods might entangle with certain evils and things like that. And we talked about that in the context of, for example, I gave a thought experiment about the making of man, and I talked about how we very casually will say things like, well, could God make man? We just say like, yeah, of course he can. Like, you're here, I'm here, obviously he can make man. But the problem you run into is that very casual response fails to recognize the fact that man is not an isolated phenomenon, right? So when you're talking about man, you're talking about a being who has certain needs, right? A man is a being who, is aerobic, right? So we need oxygen. We require hydration, right? So we need some sort of form of hydration. We have a need for food, right? We have a digestive system which needs food, and not just any food, right? Food suitable to our digestive system. We have very specific range of temperature control in which we can survive, and so on. We're bipedal, which means that we're terrestrial beings who need something to walk on, and so on. And so we went through this thought experiment about how once you start to consider, well, if God is to make man, what else does he have to make? And you start to hypothesize about a certain environment that is suitable to man. And then once you start to consider that environment, what you start to realize is that environment too has its own needs, right? When you're talking about water or oxygen, you're talking about things like pressure and photosynthesis and, things like that, which then begin to cascade into their own entanglements. And the case that I made was the idea that actually the idea of making just one man may well cascade into the production of an entire cosmos that's suitable to him. And we also talked about in that context, in that thought experiment, we talked about the idea that it's entirely possible that there may be possible beings, right? Beings God could have created that would require a very different cosmos, a cosmos incompatible with man. And in this sense, what God faces is a choice. Does he want to make man, or does he want to make, I think I called it a hominid, right? Does he want to make a hominid, which requires a cosmos that is utterly incompatible with man? And he has to choose, right? Does he want that chain of being or this chain of being? And this is actually part of the wisdom. This is certainly something that comes out in Gottfried Leibniz, where he thinks part of the wisdom of Christianity is the very fact that beings, not all beings are compossible, right? God can't create every possible thing because they seem to because certain possibilities exclude other possibilities. So the wisdom of the Eastern patristic conviction that God needs to make choices is exactly that God has the ability to do certain things that he doesn't do. And that includes creating certain types of creatures that might require a world very different than our own world. And so in this sense, yes, what's happening within the great chain of being is this expression of the divine nature, of God's goodness, of his wisdom, and so on, but also choices about the best way to express that, the best complex cosmos that fills it up with as much being as possible and most clearly articulates divine wisdom. That's the choice that has to follow. So according to the Eastern Church Fathers, that's exactly what we have. Our world is that choice for God to articulate his own divine nature as an artist articulates his artistic genius, and to do so in a way that is maximally diverse, filling up the world with a maximal refraction of divine goodness in a way that is compatible and is harmonious, right? That creates a cohesive system, that creates a grand orchestra that expresses that divine genius. Now, I've used this orchestral analogy before, right? I've talked about the fact that when it comes to music, right, if we were talking about Bach, right, we could sit here and we could say, okay, Bach, express your creative genius for us. And then we get out the little metal triangle and we hand it to him, right? Well, Bach would probably, be looking at that going, man, I can't do much with this. And that's true, right? He can't do too much with that. Now, it may well be that he can do a lot more than you or I could. And it would be pretty impressive what he comes up with. But it would have innate limitations just because of the nature of what a triangle is. And then we might be like, okay, here's some bongos, right? Okay, here's a ukulele. Right now he's starting to get, more tools available to him and so on. And then we work our way up until we get to like a cello or a piano or something like that. And all of these things sort of have innate limitations to them that in some ways, as you get to the more complex, as you get to the things that are more conducive to his creative genius, like a piano or a cello, you start to get a greater sense of the creative genius that is within Bach. But at the same time, there's a certain sense in which if Bach is limited to only the piano, there's a sense in which the articulation of his genius is still limited. Maybe the piano is not limited in terms of like the capacity to do melody, but the fact of the matter is the voice of the cello is distinct from the voice of the piano. And then when you begin to talk about the possibility of combining those various goods in an orchestral whole, now what you're starting to see is the possibility of Bach expressing his creative genius growing exponentially precisely because he has the ability to now combine all of these different instruments. And so all of a sudden, the very limited nature of a triangle has a place within a larger creative whole. So whereas, him just sort of dinging on a triangle doesn't tell us much about his creative genius, when he incorporates that into an orchestral production, now all of a sudden that has greater clarity in terms of the genius of how he's using it. And so the combination of these various instruments begins to elevate and create an even greater sort of voice, as it were, for the expression of Bach's genius. And this is what happens in the orchestral whole that is the cosmos. The idea that, yes, plants tell us something about the goodness of God. Yes, man tells us something about the goodness of God. Yes, angels tell us something about the goodness of God. But the cosmic whole in which they harmoniously coexist in one cohesive creation tells you something far more about God than you would if he just created a legion of angels or something like that. And so that expression, right, that expression of the free will of God, of the goodness of God, of his wisdom, and also of his reason, the fact that there are choices to be made in how to bring these various goods together are all things that are happening. This is what's happening within the cosmos itself, the expression of that personal, free, and rational God within our world. Now, one further thing to recognize about this vision of the cosmos is also something that was touched on earlier. I talked about the nature of goodness itself versus evil. Evil, the fact that evil is always this privation or this twisting of some good, whereas good can actually have substantial independent existence. And that always has been the Christian conviction. Yes, evil is real, also good is real, but they are not two equally opposed forces like in metaphysical dualism. Rather, the origin of creation, what creation is in itself at its beginning, is something that is entirely good. All that God makes is good. And this obviously comes out of the Genesis narrative, where God makes things and it's good and it's good and it's very good, right? Until it's not good that man's alone, but he's going to give man a helpmate and so on and so forth, right? That all of the things at its origin are ultimately good. So the question becomes, how does evil enter into such a good expression? If that's what this is, right? This refraction, this orchestral refraction or articulation of divine goodness, then how does evil ever enter the picture? Now, amongst the pagans, as we saw, there were several different answers. One of those answers was that evil is an illusion and there really is no such thing as evil. Christianity rejects that. And we've talked about metaphysical dualism, the idea that it's two equally and opposing forces, and they reject that. We've also touched on in past episodes the theory that, well, maybe it's just that matter itself is just sort of pesky, right? It's just inherently unstable, it's resistant. And so even though God is articulating his goodness in all of these different things, matter just sort of always is susceptible to this sort of inherent instability that introduces corruption. That was also something that was rejected, that matter is not to blame. Matter is being amongst the things that God made is also good, which again, that is a uniquely Christian conviction that God creates all things, including matter, as opposed to matter being just something that's there and God is a demiurge who sculpts it, right? So all of those things were off the table. Evil is not an illusion. Good and evil are not two equally imposed principles, and matter is not to blame for the corruptions that enter the world. So what is the answer? And this is where the Eastern Christian answer, which is the same as the Western answer on this, is that amongst the things that are created are rational beings. And rational beings, being free or self-determining, have the capacity to either choose the good or turn away from the good. And if they turn away from the good, they not only twist and corrupt themselves, but they begin to twist and corrupt the rest of creation. Now, the impulse might be to say, well, why not make free creatures who are not free? And here there is indeed a free will defense amongst the Eastern Fathers. And so you'll recall that I talked about some of the unique features of the Eastern patristic free will defense. Part of what they talk about is they actually take the time to explain what a creature is. And in going through the metaphysics of creatureliness, which we do in a previous episode, you can see why they have the conviction that every creature, just by virtue of being a creature, has to undergo development. It moves from possibly something to concretely something. And so when you combine creatureliness with reason and self-determination, then it is a metaphysical necessity that the creature has the capacity, has to first of all participate in its formation, identifying what the good is and choosing it, but also it's inevitable that the creature has the capacity to reject it and self-determine contrary to its own good. And as we talked about, not even God can make it otherwise. So this is just part of the, it's baked into the cake, as it were, if you're going to make free creatures. Now, the natural question might be, well, why make free creatures at all? Like, why not just make a bunch of creatures and skip the rational free ones if they're capable of corrupting this orchestral vision? And the answer, well, it's really a twofold answer. The one is very uniquely Eastern patristic, and we'll come back to it, and it has to do with the benefits that are available to the rest of the cosmos through rational and free beings. That's the one we'll come back to in a moment. But the other sort of more obvious answer is that rational beings are the most godlike of all the creatures that God makes. And so for this reason, the world is far less, right? If you're talking about a world that is meant to articulate the wisdom and goodness of God and the nature of God, to exclude from it the beings that are most godlike, the beings who are actually in God's image, is actually a major strike against the entire project, as it were, of articulating the divine nature. And so the world is much lesser for it, and even more so when you understand the other sort of role of man as microcosm and those sorts of things that we'll talk about in a second. But all that's to say is that the benefit, right, the good of making rational beings who bring with them things like love and mercy and justice and all the goods that actually are there in humanity and no place else in the rest of the cosmos, is worth the risk of us corrupting ourselves and bringing evil, especially if it's possible for God in his providence to ultimately turn us back to himself and redeem the whole and sort of scrub evil from the world, as it were, bringing all things back to himself. Again, we'll get to that as well. Now, the second, less obvious point about the making of rational beings goes to the underlying understanding of what the role of, well, particularly man is within the cosmos. And here we get to something that's rather unique within the Eastern patristic narrative. We have to look at a couple of things. One is the creation narrative itself, and also with that, what it tells us about the Eastern patristic understanding of the world as it is meant to be, right? The vision of the world as it is made to be. So in the book of Genesis, and this is actually one of course, one of the most well-known features of the Bible, even amongst people who don't know much of the Bible, they still typically are familiar with some of the basics of the book of Genesis. But within Genesis, what you have is you have God. He goes ahead and he makes all these different things, right? He makes things from the earth, right? Beasts of the field and things like that. And then he also makes things in heaven, right? The starry hosts above, things like that. And then, sorry, that was a Immanuel Kant reference, not a Genesis reference. But anyway, he makes the stars also. That's what Genesis is. But anyway, you have things of heaven and things of earth. And then what happens is that God makes man. He takes man from the dust of the earth and he breathes into him and he becomes a living spirit. Okay, so those basics and the idea that man is an image of God, like those things are really well known. But there are certain observations that the Eastern Church Fathers make about this creation story that are crucial to understanding the vision of the world. So first of all, in terms of the heavens and the earth, when you're talking about this in the book of Genesis, you're really talking about two types of thing in creation. And this sort of dichotomy within creation is something that, again, the pagans recognize. You can find Plato talk about this sort of thing. Like, for example, when he's giving his argument for the immortality of the soul, this is a central premise of it, which is that our world consists of certain things that are inherently mortal, right? They grow, they come into being, they get old, they decay, they die, and they sort of degenerate, right? So generation, corruption, Aristotle's treatise on that. And on the other hand, there's these other things that seem to be relatively immortal. On the one hand, we can look at things like math and say, well, math, that seems to not change, and it doesn't seem to grow old, and it doesn't seem to die as much as certain students in math might like it to die. But there seems to be those sorts of features of reality that don't change and aren't subject to that. And amongst those relatively immortal things was counted the angels, that the angels don't seem to be the sort of things that just sort of like get birthed and grow and develop and then get old and die or something like that. And so this is the bifurcation within the created world between the mortal and the immortal. This was rather common in ancient thinking. And Genesis actually reflects this in its talk of the heavens and the earth, right? The mortal things versus the immortal things. And yet what you see in the creation of man is something that's rather interesting, which is the merger of the mortal and the immortal. And this gives us the doctrine of man as a microcosm. So according to the Eastern Fathers, what you see is that man is this merger where God takes the things from the dust of the earth, which that represents the mortal realm, and then breathes in man from heaven, which represents the immortal realm. And you get a microcosm, a merger of these two halves of creation, where man is the merger of all the things that God has made into one being. Now, one of the questions that naturally arises is, why would God do that? And there actually is an answer according to the Eastern Church Fathers. And this goes to the idea that we are made in the image of God and ultimately what we are made to be. So a second observation that the Eastern Church Fathers make about the Genesis narrative is that in the creation narrative, God says, let us make man in our own image and according to our own likeness. And then he makes man in his own image, and likeness is not repeated. And the reason they think that's significant is because what they see is they see the image of God does refer to this reason, this free will, that rational nature, that higher part of ourselves that is an icon of God. And yet the likeness refers to the active imitation of God. So this goes to the self-determination part. So as I talked about, when you're talking about rational beings, you're talking about these are the only beings, we're the only beings who can engage in things like love in the higher sense of it. We're the only beings who can engage in justice and mercy. We're the only beings who can pray and turn to God and contemplate the mysteries of the universe and things like that, at least amongst the mortals. Obviously, angels could engage in these things as well. But we're the only sort of like mortal animal beings who can engage in those sorts of things. And so those capacities are there, right? Those powers are there. That possibility of us moving in that direction is there because of that underlying image of God. And yet, those are active expressions. And so the likeness of God has to do with the active imitation of God, by which we do ultimately become virtuous, and we show mercy and justice and love and kindness and the like. Now, the reason this is important is because this goes to the other aspect of what the Eastern Church Fathers understand to be the destiny of man. And this goes to a doctrine known as deification or theosis, the idea that man is made to participate in God. Okay, so what does this mean? Again, I've talked about this ad nauseum in other sort of episodes, and since we are being presumptuous in this episode, I'll be brief. One of the things that emerges with this essence energies distinction that I talked about earlier is also the idea that certain energies are communicable. And so a favorite analogy amongst the Eastern Church Fathers for this is the relationship between iron and fire, right? The idea that you can take iron and you can stick it in fire. And, if it gets hot enough, the iron begins to glow and burn, and you can remove it from the fire. And yet the iron is still glowing and burning. Now, where did it get those operative powers? Well, it got them from the fire. The operative powers of heating and lighting are the energies or expressions of the nature of fire. And yet somehow they've been communicated to metal. Now the metal is still metal, right? But the operative powers of the energies of another nature, a foreign nature, have been communicated to it and taken up residence within it. This is something that the Eastern Church Fathers believe is possible on a spiritual level. So this goes back to Alexandrian Judaism, which first began to toy with this concept, and then that echoes in the New Testament, and actually in really important and substantial ways to the articulation of the hope of things like resurrection, for example, and then further reverberates in the Eastern Church Fathers, who are convinced, right, that we are open spiritual systems. And as open spiritual systems, it's possible for us to commune with other spiritual realities and for the energies or operative powers of other foreign spiritual natures to take up residence within us, that we can commune with them the same way iron communes with fire. Now, this can be negative in things like a demoniac, right? One who ends up having a sort of symbiotic relationship where they're energized by the devil, as Paul says in the book of Ephesians, the letter to the Ephesians. Or it can be positive, right? And you see this in things like the prophets and the apostles who are energized by God. And specifically, you see it most potently actually in the person of Christ himself. So keep in mind that in the incarnation, which I don't want to get ahead of ourselves in terms of the narrative, but in the incarnation, what you have is you have a union between God and man. And in that union, what you see is the divinity ends up communicating itself to the nature of man. And you see things like Christ is transfigured and he glows. And ultimately, you see him raised from the dead, resurrected, not merely reanimated, but resurrected, metamorphosed, right, in a way in which he is immune to death. And you begin to see man as he's supposed to be. Now, I am getting ahead of myself in the narrative. But the point of that is to say that their conviction is that man is capable, as an image of God, is capable of partaking of the divine nature and participating in the divine attributes, not just imitating in a sort of outward way love and justice and things like that, but actually communing with God, communing with the spiritual world, and specifically communing with the divine nature, and ultimately being transfigured as a result. And this is actually where the understanding of the promise of things like eternal life come from. Eternal life or immortality, the things that are promised to man, the hope of man in the gospel, are ultimately not just a divine magic trick by which God says, like, poof, you don't die anymore. But instead what they are is they are byproducts of partaking of the divine nature. Why? Well, because Paul says explicitly, God alone is immortal. He says that to Timothy. And then God offers to us in the gospel immortality. Well, how is that possible, right? The conviction is that what you're seeing is that the hope of man, of becoming more than we are in ourselves, of transcending our sort of lower mortal nature, is actually a hope that comes from communion with God, partaking the divine nature, which is what Peter also says, right? We escape the corruption that's come upon the world by partaking in the divine nature. So that's the belief, right? That's the conviction. Now, the reason that's important, the reason it's important to understand that as images of God, we are capable of partaking of the divine nature, of being energized by God and ultimately being deified, is because this goes to the original vision of what man is made to be. So let's go back to my orchestral analogy before, right? I talked about the fact that a triangle has certain innate limitations, right? This little metal triangle, Bach can't do much with it in terms of articulating his musical genius. He can do much more with like a cello or something like that. But I also mentioned that in the orchestral context, when he does a composition that's made for an entire orchestra, now the triangle is brought into that. Now the triangle is actually elevated. It's able to participate in the genius of Bach to a greater degree because of its union with the other instruments. And this is, by analogy, what they understand, what the Eastern Church Fathers understand to be the purpose of man as microcosm. The lower things of nature, the things that are inherently irrational and mortal, cannot participate in God in the same way an icon of God can. They cannot participate in God to the same degree or in the same ways as an angel can. inevitably so, right? We've talked about in past episodes the idea that reason and free will, the knowledge of what you ought to do and ought not to do, the ability to do it or not do it, are necessary conditions for moral properties. So the idea that the lower things of creation could ever participate in certain divine attributes that require reason and free will, for example, is evident. And yet, if those lower things in creation are merged with, are combined with something that is in the image of God, if there is a merger of heaven and of earth, then there is the possibility of those lower things being raised up, of partaking of the divine nature and participating in God to a greater degree than they would be capable otherwise. Just like our triangle in isolation has a very limited capacity to participate in Bach, but when put in the context of an orchestra, it has a greater capacity to partake of the genius of Bach than it does on its own. And this is how they understand the doctrine of man as microcosm, that what we are is a merger of the mortal and the immortal for the purpose of the lower things of creation participating in God, partaking of the divine nature in a way that they could not otherwise. And this goes to the original vision of creation. That what the vision of creation is not just a chain of being that articulates all of God's wisdom and power and goodness, an intricate, set of beings or something like that. Rather, God desiring all creatures to partake of him to the highest degree possible, to even transcend the limitations of their own nature, desires to pour forth his own being, his divine energies, into this hierarchy and see it cascade down from the hierarchy of angels ultimately through man, the microcosm, and to the lower things of creation. And so the vision for creation is one in which the divine nature, which is beyond all, expresses itself in a hierarchy of beings and then begins to pour forth that nature in its divine energies to things like angels who can partake of that and become conduits of that. And it can cascade down from those angels to lower orders of angels, to man, and then from man on into the organic realm and so on. And this is one of the reasons why all of creation groans for the unveiling of the sons of God. Why? Because we are the bridge for them to partake of God in a higher degree than they are capable of their own. So if we were to play out the creation narrative in such a way that there is no fall and there is no corruption, things like that, what you would see is not just transfigured man, virtuous and good and immortal and incorrupt and things like that, but with him, you would also see transfigured creation. This is the sort of thing you get in glimpses, in a foretaste amongst, the stories of the saints, where you see animals behaving differently than they otherwise would, or plants growing in odd ways that they otherwise wouldn't, because they are starting to get a taste of participating in the divine nature that elevates them in a way that transcends their innate limitations. And that's the original vision for the cosmos. The idea that God is everywhere present and filling all things, energizing and transfiguring all of creation, not just man, like as if we are abstract souls, but also our bodies, also the organic world from which our bodies are taken, all of creation partaking of God, where he is everywhere present, filling all things, the light of all of creation. That's the vision. But there is a catch. At the center of this plan, the hinge point of this plan is a self-determining being. And this goes to another question that the Eastern Church Fathers raise. Now, they're not the first to raise it. Philo of Alexandria raises it before them. But it's the question of, when you take the mortal realm and you merge it with the immortal realm, as you do with man as microcosm, what did you make, right? Did you make something that's mortal or something that's immortal? Which one was Adam? And this is, again, a contrast in how the Eastern Fathers understand these things relative to the West. Rather than seeing Eden as some sort of ideal state that was lost and we're trying to regain. Instead, they understood it to be the starting point for the original plan. The answer, according to them, which is, you find in Philo, and then you find it as early as Theophilus of Antioch, and then on to people like Nemesius of Emesa, is that Adam, man, was originally made neither. He was made potentially mortal and he was made potentially immortal. In other words, as a merger of the heavens and the earth, man had the capacity, we have the capacity to either partake of God and be sort of elevated above our natural limitations by partaking of the divine nature, or we have the ability to retreat into our animal nature and live like animals, growing old, getting sick, dying, right? And man had a choice, right, to either turn his soul toward God and partake of the divine nature and raise up with him his own lower nature, and with that lower nature raise up the rest of the organic world. Or he could have retreated from God and subjugated the higher nature to the lower nature and lived and died like an animal. And that right there is the nature of the fall, the idea that our nature has in some ways been inverted, the higher nature subjected to the lower nature, which is why we live and we die like animals. And yet, buried beneath that, there's this memory of what we are supposed to be. That's why we struggle with conscience, because we are aware of the moral ramifications of our world. We long for something more than just sort of animalistic, hedonistic pleasure. We long for higher ends. And we find ourselves aching for something more meaningful than animal life. Well, why is that there? Because buried beneath the animal nature is the higher nature that is supposed to bring us, supposed to usher us to something more. Okay, I think that's probably a good pause point here in this final exploration of the problem of evil. And next week, we'll be coming at you with part 2 of the Eastern patristic narrative about God and world and the place of evil within it. I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. Hey, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. Go ahead and hit that bell if there is a bell, and leave a comment. I hear that's great for the algorithm, and also like it and tell your friends. I really appreciate your support. And until next time.